We're back in the onesie for this video. Look at me, you probably think I'm so demure. No you don't, because you're not a fucking trendy TikTok loser! We're up to review number 6 for the book along list. This one is by the token Aussie on the list, and it is Charlotte Wood's Stone Yard Devotional. This book is about a woman who stays in a convent, and she thinks about things, and there's also mice. This book reminded me of my many attempts to read The Magic Mountain. It reminded me of, like, some of the John Fosse attitude, and it reminded me a lot of Study for Obedience, which I will talk about in terms of comparison later. This book is, as I said, about a woman who lives in a convent, and she moves there, and I believe she used to work for some environmental agency, and while she lives there, she starts thinking back on her life and interpreting things differently and processing certain things, and while that happens, as I said, there are mice. I enjoyed the first half of the book, and I think the book kind of baits you into thinking a certain way about it. There's the way that elements in the present are being introduced, and you feel like they're building to something, towards some kind of revelation or some moment of change, and then that just doesn't happen. You kind of hit a point with the development where you kind of plateau, and then the book continues to repeat itself. But that first half I really enjoyed, where it's the woman at the convent. I'm kind of being introduced to the way the author is going to be writing this. There's jumping back and forth and it gets more and more intense. You can feel things building, even if they don't resolve themselves in any way. Something about isolation and removal from chaotic existence forces you to go back over your memories and think about them differently. And I think the book did a great job of showing that, and how that kind of return to memory and that flow can be disrupted in certain ways. The process of this woman sinking into her lifestyle, and we see that in very painstaking detail, is also, as I said, a return to memory, where she ponders over past sins. The sins of viewpoint, or expectation, or false understanding. And it's interesting that it's not really a process of her converting into this, but just a product of the environment that she's in. I feel like that's kind of what the author's getting to. I think this might also be a sneaky book about COVID. I have no interest in delving into that deeper, but the author uses certain phrases and words that we only associate with the pandemic now. I like the relationship between good and ego, and that was a major portion of the memories, and I thought that the metaphorical purposes of certain recurring things in the book were made clear enough. I will also say that the author never gets boxed into describing just one theme. I would not say that this is a monotonous book, in the sense that I don't think that she's just harping on about the same thing. I think she gives herself quite a wide range of topics to talk about. The narrator in this book isn't as engaging as the one in Study for Obedience, not even close, and the narrator in this book is clearly a vessel for the author's ability to illustrate the jagged flows of memory and things like that. And the book sinks you into this movement of life with these weird rhythms of memory and this very repetitive life that she's living. I like all of this book in theory. The problem is that it's really fucking boring. All of the memory segments in this book clearly are saying something about the nature of solitude. Perhaps there's an ecological message as well. But the problem is, in the back half of this book, they come in this absolutely relentless tide that is signposted, but I found unbelievably boring, and I feel like it dulled a lot of the quality of the writing in itself, in between scenes, and I was not a big fan of how the book kind of just started to abuse me. I finished the book and then I went back to reread just chunks out of order, like just single memory segments as if they were short stories. And when that happened, I found them very engaging, and I also found a lot to pick apart in those. But when I was reading the book just back to back as its own thing, and I was thinking that there would be some resolution to something, that was my mistake, I found that none of that was coming out to me, and it was all just like blending together and becoming this sort of big soup where nothing felt particularly unique. I like them individually, but my god, the brain is not meant to process them when they are put all neatly in a row with their fucking shoes tied. Yeah, it just doesn't work for me. It does feel like limbo when you're reading it, which is part of it, and I mean, there are lots of really great short stories in there if you were to treat it as such. There's a short story that involves Vietnamese people that I thought was really good, but again, it becomes this kind of like muddied oblivion when you're reading it, particularly in that back half. I think that's just mostly on me, where I just don't like seeing the really good stuff in a book and then finding it boring just through its presentation, because this book does things that an interesting book would do, but it's just not interesting to me, and that's very frustrating. I personally didn't care much to read into the book, especially by the end. I mean, there's these themes of solitude of faith and ego, as I said, and there's the way that kind of solitude causes regret to bleed out of you. And these are things that I experienced while I read the book, but when I finished it, I wasn't thinking, what did the mice mean? Yeah, I think the cut back to mice happens too much. I like the mice stuff, I like that it's kind of gory, but I think the symbol of it is very, very clear. It's the idea that her existence is being undone by memory. She has this solitude, this kind of perfect small existence, and it's being ferreted into by her own memories, and so that's causing these mice to come into her physical environment because her environment is the reason that she's thinking the way that she is. I like that, but I just think we cut back to it way too much. The metaphor is very clear. We just keep getting these repetitive instances of seeing the mice, and that is part of the point, but again, I just found it boring. And it's interesting how monotonous that sort of surreal gimmick becomes. That is interesting to me, like sort of conceptually, but again, it doesn't mean I have to enjoy it. At the end of the book, I guess the main character finally addresses the death of her mother and that grief head on, and I was utterly unmoved by it because of the way that the book was presented. But I also don't think the book was expecting me to have some kind of like emotional revelation at that point. It's very strange. The book is relentlessly boring, and I have praised other books like Ninth Building for doing that because it feels like part of the point. And with this book, I think I just have to call a spade a spade. I'm just not into it, but I have a lot of respect for it. I find a lot of weight in the kind of crocheted rhythms of the book, and again, I like the fact that the memory stuff kind of takes over the present, and that becomes the focus in the back half. I think the way that it does that is very sort of subtle and slow. I think that Charlotte Wood is an excellent writer. There's no denying that. I just could not get on with this book. It's a mood piece that changes its focus, it says different things at different times, and it throws a lot of paint on the wall with these memory segments, and some of it hits when you read it individually, but back to back, you kind of have to take it as this relentless tide. You kind of have to dull a lot of the meaning of the book. It's really hard to read the book and take all of these individual segments and like feel the full weight of them because of the way it's written, because of the rhythms of the book, you see those segments and they're playing a different purpose, which is to show you about the flow of memory, not about the things in them themselves. Does that make sense? I found this book relentlessly boring, though, in the back half, and not particularly invigorating, and I felt like it was unwilling to develop on itself in a way that was deliberate, but again, was very dull. I feel almost identical to this book as I do for Study for Obedience, but the reason I like Study for Obedience more personally is because it is half the length. I think that the book is amazing if you view it as a collection of short stories. I think that Wood is an incredibly talented author, and it's awesome that she's on this long list. That's fucking great. I would love to see this book on the shortlist, even though I'm not the biggest fan of it, and it wouldn't be in a personal shortlist of mine, because it is so weird, it's so criticky, and it would give a nice contrast to the other bullshit that's on the long list this year. And also because she's Australian, we have to big up the Australians because they won't put Alexis right. If you like this book, you are a smarter one than I have to give it a 5 out of 10, even though I want to give it higher. But yeah, again, very talented author, very talented book, but just something that was making choices I couldn't get on with. And I will read more from her from having read this, because I know that there's going to be one that I really like. Thanks for watching. We're nearly halfway through the long list for these reviews. I'm working like 6 or 7 days a week now, so I don't get a lot of time to record them. As you see, I just fucking woke up, so yeah, I'll get them out when I can. Bye!